The Galactic Council chamber stretched across 3 kilometers of polished stone and living crystal. Representatives from 400 species filled its rising seats, their voices creating a constant hum of translation devices and whispered negotiations. For 12,000 years, this chamber had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the forging of treaties that shaped entire civilizations, and the slow march of progress across 9 spiral arms of the galaxy. Laura sat in the human section, a small cluster of seats near the back of the chamber. Humanity had joined the Council only 60 years ago, making them the youngest species ever admitted to this ancient assembly. Their section was modest, barely visible from the central speaking platform, and their voting power reflected their junior status. 3 votes out of 12,000, a whisper in a hurricane. Laura had served as humanity's ambassador for 8 years now. She was a tall woman with gray streaks in her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of too many long nights and difficult conversations. She had learned patience in this chamber. She had learned to smile when her proposals were dismissed without discussion. She had learned to nod politely when older species reminded her that humans were still infants in cosmic terms, barely capable of understanding the complexities of galactic governance. Today, like most days, she sat quietly while the council debated matters that would affect billions of lives. A trade dispute between the collective and the Dominion, resource allocation for frontier colonies, the usual business of running a galaxy. Her communication device vibrated against her wrist, a message from Earth, marked with the highest priority seal. Laura glanced at the chamber floor where speaker was delivering yet another speech about the importance of maintaining traditional hierarchies. No one would notice if she checked her messages. She opened the transmission and read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly this time. Her face remained perfectly calm, a skill she had perfected over years of diplomatic service. But something changed in her eyes. A light went out, or perhaps a different light came on. Laura stood up. She gathered her data tablets, her ceremonial sash, and the small photograph of her family that she kept on her desk. She placed everything neatly into her bag, smoothed her uniform, and walked toward the exit. Her aide, a young man named Park, looked up in confusion. "Ambassador," he whispered, "the session is not over. Is something wrong?" Laura paused and looked at him with an expression he had never seen before. It was not anger or sadness. It was something closer to peace, like a person who had finally set down a weight they had been carrying for far too long. "We are leaving," she said simply, "all of us today." She did not explain further. She did not look back at the chamber where she had spent 8 years of her life fighting for recognition that never came. She simply walked out, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. Within the hour, every human in the diplomatic quarter began packing their belongings. There were no dramatic announcements, no angry speeches broadcast across the communication networks, just quiet, methodical departure. Humans closed their offices, said polite goodbyes to confused colleagues, and made their way to the transport stations. Across council space, the same scene repeated itself. On space stations and colony worlds, on research facilities and military outposts, humans stopped what they were doing and began to leave. They returned borrowed equipment. They filed their final reports. They watered the plants they had been tending and left notes for whoever would take over their duties. High Counselor noticed the empty seats 3 hours after Laura left. The tall, silver-skinned leader of the council had been absorbed in mediating the trade dispute, a task that required all of his considerable diplomatic skills. When he finally looked toward the human section, he felt a strange chill run through his ancient bones. The seats were empty, not just empty of people, but empty of everything. The humans had removed their flags, their decorations, even the small potted plants they had brought from Earth. It was as if they had never been there at all. Signaled for a recess and summoned his senior advisors. "What is happening with the human delegation?" he demanded. His chief of staff, a nervous creature named consulted his data screens with trembling appendages. They are leaving, High Counselor. All of them. Every human in council space appears to be departing for their home systems. Why, what are their demands? Looked up with confusion in his multiple eyes. There are no demands, High Counselor. They have not issued any statements. They simply left. Stood in silence for a long moment. In 12,000 years of council history, no species had ever simply left. There had been dramatic withdrawals accompanied by declarations of war. There had been lengthy negotiations and bitter disputes, but no one had ever just walked away without a word. Perhaps it is for the best, said Speaker, who had joined the conversation without invitation. The humans have always been an uncomfortable presence here, too emotional, too unpredictable. Let them go sulk in their little corner of the galaxy. They will come crawling back when they realize how much they need us. Several other senior council members nodded in agreement. The humans were young, after all, barely a century of space travel. They had probably gotten their feelings hurt over some minor slight and decided to throw a tantrum. It would pass. But could not shake the chill he had felt when he saw those empty seats. He had lived for 3,000 years and had developed instincts that went beyond logic or reason. Something about this felt different. Something about the quiet, dignified way the humans had departed reminded him of something he could not quite name. He thought about all the times he had seen humans in the corridors of the council complex. They were always busy, always moving with purpose. They worked in the medical centers and the engineering bays. They served in the cafeterias and the maintenance departments. They filled positions that other species considered beneath their dignity, and they did so with strange enthusiasm. Had never really thought about what they were doing in those positions. He had assumed they were simply accepting whatever work they could get as a junior species. But now, watching the empty seats where their delegation had sat, he began to wonder if there was something more to it. 3 days, he told himself. Give them 3 days to make their demands known. Then we will respond accordingly. He returned to the council session, pushing his unease aside. There was work to be done, disputes to settle, a galaxy to govern. The humans would come back when they were ready to talk. They always did. Every species eventually learned that they needed the council more than the council needed them. But as took his seat on the elevated platform, he noticed that the chamber felt slightly colder than before, slightly emptier, and he could not help glancing at those vacant seats in the back, wondering what the humans knew that the rest of the council did not. The first reports came from the frontier medical stations on the edge of space. Director Al of the 7th District Hospital sent an urgent message to the council headquarters, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Half of his staff had disappeared overnight. Not just any staff, but the ones who worked the difficult shifts, the ones who volunteered for dangerous assignments, the ones who held the hands of dying patients when no one else would. They were all human. Al had never really paid attention to how many humans worked in his facility. They had always been there, reliable and tireless, filling the gaps that no one else wanted to fill. He had assumed they were assigned to these positions because they lacked the qualifications for better work. Now, standing in empty corridors with patients crying out for care, he realized how wrong he had been. Similar messages flooded the council communication networks over the following days. Research stations reported that critical experiments had been abandoned. Military outposts discovered that their maintenance systems were failing without the human technicians who had kept them running. Trading posts found that the navigational data they relied upon had been compiled almost entirely by human cartographers who had ventured into regions too dangerous for anyone else to explore. Speaker called an emergency session of the Council's Economic Committee. She stood before the assembled representatives with her usual confidence, dismissing the growing concerns with a wave of her slender arm. This is temporary disruption, she declared. The humans performed low-level work that any species could do. We simply need to reassign personnel and continue with normal operations. But when her own advisors tried to reassign personnel, they discovered an uncomfortable truth. No one wanted to do the work that humans had been doing. The shifts were too long, the conditions too harsh, the compensation too low. Other species had standards and expectations. Humans had apparently had none, or at least none that they ever expressed. 3 cargo fleets were lost in the nebula during the second week of the human departure. The nebula was a treacherous region of unstable space, filled with gravitational anomalies that could tear a ship apart without warning. For decades, human navigators had been mapping safe passages through this region, updating their charts daily based on sensor data and personal observation. They had shared this information freely with anyone who needed it, never asking for payment or recognition. Without those updated charts, the cargo fleets followed outdated routes. 200 ships disappeared into the swirling chaos of the nebula. 15,000 crew members from a dozen different species never came home. Commander of the military requested a private meeting with High Counselor. She was a decorated officer, veteran of 3 major conflicts, not known for emotional displays. But when she entered the High Counselor's chambers, her hands were shaking. "I have been investigating the human departure," she said without preamble, trying to understand the full scope of their involvement in council operations. "And what have you found?" Placed a data tablet on his desk. The screen displayed a complex web of connections, thousands of lines linking human personnel to every major system in council space. They were everywhere, High Counselor, not in positions of power or authority, but in the positions that no one else wanted. The dangerous ones, the thankless ones, the ones that keep everything running but never appear in official reports. She began listing examples. Human engineers maintained the communication relay stations in remote sectors, often using their own resources when council funding fell short. Human doctors staffed the clinics on plague worlds where other species refused to serve. Human teachers worked in refugee camps, educating children who had lost everything. Human soldiers stood watch on the most dangerous borders, taking shifts that their counterparts from other species rejected as too risky. They never complained, continued. They never demanded better treatment or higher pay. They just kept working, year after year, holding everything together while we ignored them. Stared at the data on the screen. He thought about all the times he had walked past human workers in the corridors without acknowledging their presence. He thought about the council sessions where human proposals were dismissed without discussion because they came from a junior species with no real standing. Why did they do it, he asked quietly. Why would any species accept such treatment? Shook her head. I do not know, High Counselor, but I think we should have asked that question a long time ago. The council chamber was quieter now during sessions, not because of any official reduction in business, but because the small background tasks that humans had performed were no longer being done. The translation systems occasionally glitched because the human technicians who calibrated them were gone. The lighting flickered because human maintenance crews no longer walked the corridors at night. Even the plants in the central garden were beginning to wilt because no one remembered to water them. Speaker addressed the council with less confidence than before. Her own species, the collective, was reporting serious problems. Human agricultural specialists had been working on her outer colonies, developing crops that could survive in harsh conditions. Without them, 3 colonies faced the prospect of famine within the next growing season. When finished her report, she did not dismiss the human departure as a tantrum. She did not suggest that they would come crawling back. She simply stood in silence, unable to meet the eyes of her fellow council members. High Counselor retired to his chambers that night and did something he had not done in centuries. He prayed to the old gods of his people, the ones who watched over travelers in the darkness between stars. He asked them to help him understand what was happening and what he should do about it. But the gods, if they heard him at all, offered no answers. The only sound in his chambers was the distant hum of failing systems, and the silence where human voices used to be. On the border of Council space, the last human ships were completing their journey home. They traveled in orderly formations, their running lights blinking in the darkness like a procession of fireflies returning to their nests. They passed through checkpoints without incident, politely declining all requests for explanation. Ambassador Laura stood on the observation deck of her transport vessel, watching the stars slide past. A young officer approached her hesitantly. "Ambassador, we have received 17 more requests for negotiation from the Council. They are offering significant concessions. Should I prepare a response?" Laura did not turn from the window. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who looked both tired and strangely at peace. "No response," she said, "not yet. But they are asking what we want. They seem willing to give us almost anything." Laura finally turned to face the young officer. She smiled sadly. "That is exactly the problem," she said. "They are asking what we want because they need something from us. They never asked before, when we were just trying to help. They never wondered why we worked so hard or whether we were happy. They only care now because our absence is causing them pain." She looked back at the stars, at the distant glow of Council space falling away behind them. Let them feel that pain for a while longer. Let them understand what they had before they start making promises about what they will do better. Because if they do not understand, truly understand, then nothing will really change. The ship continued its journey through the darkness, carrying its passengers home to a world that had decided, after 60 years of trying, that some lessons could only be taught through silence. The Council sent its first official delegation to Earth during the 3rd week of the human departure. High Counselor selected his most skilled diplomats, representatives from the oldest and most respected species in the galaxy. They traveled aboard the finest vessel in the Council fleet, carrying gifts and proposals designed to appeal to human sensibilities. The delegation was stopped at the edge of human space by a small patrol ship. A young officer named Danny appeared on their communication screen, his face polite but unreadable. "I am sorry, but we cannot permit Council vessels to enter human territory at this time," he said. "You are welcome to transmit any messages through official channels, and we will ensure they reach the appropriate authorities." The lead diplomat, an ancient being named who had negotiated treaties for 600 years, leaned forward with practiced warmth. "Surely there has been some misunderstanding, young one. We come with offers of friendship and reconciliation. The High Counselor himself has authorized significant concessions. If you would simply allow us to speak with your leaders directly, I am certain we can resolve whatever concerns have caused this unfortunate separation." Danny nodded respectfully, but did not change his position. "I understand and I will pass along your message, but my orders are clear. No Council vessels may enter human space until further notice. I apologize for any inconvenience." The diplomat tried everything. He offered bribes, made threats, appealed to shared history, and promised rewards beyond imagination. Danny remained polite, remained calm, and remained absolutely immovable. After 3 hours of futile negotiation, the delegation was forced to turn back. They returned to Council space, with nothing but confusion and growing fear. The second delegation included military observers, not as a threat, insisted, but simply to demonstrate the Council's serious intent. 12 warships accompanied the diplomatic vessel, their weapons powered down but visible, a reminder of the Council's vast resources and reach. This delegation was also stopped at the border. The same young officer appeared on their screens, wearing the same polite expression. "I see you have brought warships," he observed. "I hope this is not meant as a threat. We have no desire for conflict with the Council." The military commander, a general named, stepped forward with barely concealed irritation. "It is not a threat," he said, "but you must understand that the Council cannot simply accept this situation indefinitely. You are a minor species with limited resources. Surely you recognize that cooperation with the Council is in your best interest." Danny was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was still polite, but there was something harder underneath. "General, I grew up on a farming colony on the outer edge of human space. When I was 12 years old, pirates attacked our settlement. The Council was, but no help came. We were told that our colony was too remote, too insignificant to warrant military response." He paused. "My father organized the defense. 43 farmers with mining equipment and converted tractors against 200 armed raiders. We held them off for 6 days until our own ships could arrive. My father lost his arm in that fight. My mother lost her life." The general shifted uncomfortably, but did not speak. "After the attack, the Council sent a representative to assess the damage. He told us that we should consider relocating to a more secure area, somewhere the Council could more easily protect. He did not apologize for the help that never came. He did not acknowledge my mother's sacrifice or my father's courage. He simply suggested that our suffering was our own fault for choosing to live somewhere inconvenient." Danny looked directly at the general. "So when you tell me that cooperation with the Council is in our best interest, I find myself wondering whose interest you really mean. Now, I must respectfully ask you to leave human space. If you choose not to leave, we will not fight you, but we will not help you either, and I think you are beginning to understand how much you have come to rely on our help." The delegation retreated once again. Back on the Council, systems continued to fail. The communication network between distant sectors became increasingly unreliable. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for centuries were now plagued by delays and accidents. The Council's own administrative systems were overwhelmed as personnel tried to handle tasks that had previously been managed by human volunteers working overtime without complaint. Speaker resigned her position after food riots broke out on 2 of her species' colony worlds. The agricultural programs that humans had been developing were abandoned mid-cycle, and the crops they had been nurturing died in the fields. Stood before the Council one final time, her voice hollow with defeat. "I was wrong," she said simply. "We were all wrong. I mocked the humans for being young and emotional. I dismissed their contributions as insignificant. I was so certain that we did not need them." She looked around the chamber at her fellow Council members. "We needed them more than we ever knew. And worse than that, they gave us everything they had and we treated them like servants instead of partners. I do not know if they will ever come back, but if they do, I hope we have learned enough to deserve them." She walked out of the chamber for the last time, and no one tried to stop her. High Counselor spent his nights reviewing records of human activities in Council space. The more he learned, the more ashamed he became. Human doctors had developed treatments for diseases that afflicted other species, sharing their research freely even when their own people received no benefit. Human engineers had designed improvements to Council systems, never claiming credit or compensation. Human diplomats had mediated countless disputes between other species, working tirelessly to find common ground. And in return, humanity had received a small section of seats at the back of the Council chamber, and the constant reminder that they were too young to understand the complexities of galactic civilization. Found himself thinking about a human concept he had once dismissed as naive. They called it service. Not the kind of service that expected reward, but the kind that found meaning in the act itself. The kind that gave without counting the cost. He had thought it was weakness. Now he wondered if it was the greatest strength he had ever encountered. Through back channels and intermediary contacts, finally managed to arrange a communication with Ambassador Laura. Her face appeared on his private screen, calm and patient as always. "Ambassador," he began and then stopped. He had prepared speeches, arguments, offers of unprecedented concessions. But looking at her steady gaze, all of his carefully crafted words seemed hollow. "I do not know what to say," he admitted finally. "I do not know how to fix what we have broken." Laura was quiet for a long moment. "High Counselor, may I ask you a question?" "Of course." "In 60 years of human membership in the Council, did anyone ever ask what humans needed? Did anyone wonder why we worked so hard for so little recognition? Did the Council ever consider that perhaps we were not serving out of weakness, but because service was sacred to us?" Searched his memory. 6 decades of council sessions, diplomatic meetings, official functions. He could not recall a single instance when anyone had asked those questions. "No," he said. "No, we never asked." Laura nodded slowly. "That is why we left, High Counselor. Not because we wanted power or recognition, but because we realized that no matter how much we gave, the Council would never see us as anything more than useful tools. And tools cannot be partners. Tools cannot be family." She leaned forward slightly. "When you understand that, truly understand it, perhaps we can talk about what comes next." The screen went dark, leaving alone with his thoughts and the distant sound of failing systems that no one knew how to repair. 1 month after the human departure, the Council established a special commission to document every human contribution to galactic civilization. It was meant to be a simple administrative task, a way of understanding the scope of the problem so that solutions could be developed. But as the reports came in from every corner of Council space, the Commission members found themselves overwhelmed by what they discovered. The collective submitted the first major findings. Their investigators had traced the history of human involvement on their worlds, expecting to find records of minor assistance and temporary assignments. Instead, they found something that brought the Commission to stunned silence. For 38 years, human teachers had been running schools for orphan children. These were not official programs or funded initiatives. Individual humans had simply noticed that orphanages on worlds lacked educational resources, and they had volunteered their time. They taught language and mathematics, history and science. They organized sports programs and art classes. They celebrated birthdays and held graduation ceremonies. None of this had been requested. None of it had been acknowledged. The government had been entirely unaware that thousands of their most vulnerable children were being educated by strangers from a species they barely considered worthy of notice. One teacher, a woman named Grace Mitchell, had spent 22 years at a single orphanage on the frontier. She had arrived as a young volunteer and stayed until her hair turned white, teaching 3 generations of children. When she finally returned to human space with the departure, her students organized a memorial in her honor, placing her photograph in the school's main hall alongside portraits of their most honored ancestors. The report was equally devastating. Commander personally presented the findings to the commission, her voice steady but her eyes filled with something that might have been shame. Human soldiers had been volunteering for the most dangerous assignments on borders for decades. They took the posts that other species refused, standing watch in locations where survival was measured in weeks rather than years. They did not complain about the conditions or the lack of support. They simply served. One human, a sergeant named, had defended a remote outpost against raiders for 17 days while waiting for reinforcements that kept being delayed. He was wounded on the 3rd day, seriously wounded on the 7th, and nearly dead by the 12th. But he kept fighting because there were 3 families sheltering in the outpost's basement, and he had promised them that he would keep them safe. Reinforcements finally arrived on the 17th day. Died 2 hours later, still clutching his weapon, still positioned between the families and the door. The military had never issued an official commendation. They had not even recorded his name in their reports. He was just another human volunteer who had served and died in a conflict that was not his own. The Dominion's report focused on cultural preservation. Human archivists and linguists had been working across Council space to document dying languages and fading traditions. They recorded songs that had not been sung in centuries. They transcribed stories that existed only in the memories of elderly survivors. They created archives of art, music, poetry, and history that would have been lost forever without their intervention. One linguistic team had spent 11 years learning a Dominion dialect spoken by fewer than 200 individuals on a remote moon. They created dictionaries, grammar guides, and audio recordings. They taught young Dominion students to speak the language of their ancestors, and when their work was complete, they simply moved on to the next endangered tradition, never seeking recognition or reward. Every species in the council had similar stories. Human nurses who worked triple shifts during epidemics, human engineers who redesigned failing systems without being asked, human artists who created beauty in places that had forgotten what beauty looked like, human mediators who spent years resolving conflicts between species that had been fighting for generations. The Commission compiled its final report with a sense of growing despair. The document ran to thousands of pages, each one filled with accounts of sacrifice and service that had never been acknowledged. Human contribution to galactic civilization was not minor or incidental. It was fundamental. The Council had been built on a foundation of human labor and human love, and no one had ever bothered to look down and see what was holding them up. High Counselor read the report alone in his chambers. When he finished, he sat in darkness for a long time, thinking about what he had learned. He thought about the Council's 12,000 years of history. They had built great civilizations, achieved remarkable advances, created systems that governed hundreds of worlds. They were proud of their accomplishments, and rightly so. But how much of that accomplishment was built on the silent labor of those they considered beneath notice? How many species had contributed without acknowledgement? How many voices had been dismissed because they were young or different or simply unwilling to fight for recognition? The humans had shown the Council something important, not through war or threats, but through absence. They had revealed the truth that the Council had been unwilling to see, that greatness was not measured in power or age, but in how you treated those who served you without demanding anything in return. Summon the full Council for a special session. Representatives from every species gathered in the Great Chamber, their faces reflecting the exhaustion and fear of the past month. Systems were failing, economies were crumbling, and no one knew how to stop the decline. The High Counselor took his position on the elevated platform and looked out at the assembled representatives. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he began to speak, and his words carried a weight that silenced even the most restless members. "I have been High Counselor for 300 years," he said. "In that time, I have witnessed triumphs and tragedies, wars and peace, the birth of new civilizations and the death of old ones. I believed that I understood the nature of power and the responsibilities of leadership." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was wrong. We were all wrong. We measured our worth in votes and influence, in military strength and economic power. We looked down on those who served without demanding recognition, believing that their service was proof of their inferiority." His voice grew quieter, but every word reached every corner of the chamber. "The humans taught us differently, not through speeches or protests, but through 60 years of quiet sacrifice that we never bothered to acknowledge. They gave us everything they had, and we treated them as children playing at civilization." Looked at the empty seats in the human section. "I am ashamed," he said simply. "I am ashamed of what we did and what we failed to do, and I do not know if we can ever make it right, but I know that we must try. Not because we need the humans to return, though we do, but because if we cannot learn this lesson, then we do not deserve to call ourselves a civilization at all." The chamber was silent. No one argued. No one made excuses. For perhaps the first time in 12,000 years, the Galactic Council sat together in shared recognition of their failure. And somewhere across the vast darkness of space, humanity waited and watched, wondering if the Council would finally understand what they had been trying to teach them all along. 2 months after the departure, Ambassador Laura returned to the council chamber. She came alone, without escort or ceremony, walking through the same corridors she had walked for 8 years. The guards who had once barely acknowledged her presence now stood at attention as she passed. The diplomats who had once looked through her as if she were invisible now bowed their heads in respect. Laura noticed these changes, but her expression remained calm. She had not returned for recognition or apology. She had returned because she believed, despite everything, that the council was capable of change. She took her seat in the human section at the back of the chamber. The seats around her were still empty, but she sat there anyway, alone among the hundreds of representatives who filled the rising tiers. For a long moment, no one spoke. The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. High Counselor rose from his elevated platform. Then he did something that no High Counselor had done in 12,000 years of council history. He stepped down from his position of authority and walked across the chamber floor to the human section. He climbed the steps to where Laura sat and stood before her, not as the leader of galactic civilization, but as one person facing another. "Ambassador," he said, his voice carrying through the silent chamber, "I have a question to ask you. A question I should have asked 60 years ago when humanity first joined this council." Laura looked up at him and waited. "What do humans need?" The question hung in the air. It was simple, almost childish in its directness, but Laura understood its weight. For 60 years, the council had made assumptions about human desires. They had offered votes and influence, territory and resources, all the things that older species valued. They had never stopped to ask if those things mattered to humanity at all. Laura stood to face the High Counselor. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "We do not need power," she said. "We do not need recognition or wealth or territory. We have never sought to dominate or control." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What humans need is to matter. We need to know that when we give everything we have, someone notices. Someone cares. We need to be seen not as children or servants, but as partners, as family." "Family," repeated softly. "Yes, family. We understand that we are young by galactic standards. We accept that we have much to learn. But family does not dismiss the youngest member simply because they have less experience. Family does not take sacrifice for granted or ignore those who serve without complaint." Laura looked around the chamber at the hundreds of faces watching her. "For 60 years, we tried to show you who we were through our actions. We worked beside you, bled beside you, died beside you. We asked for nothing in return because we believed that true service needs no reward. But we also believed that eventually you would see us for what we were trying to be." Her voice grew softer but somehow more powerful. "Partners, equals, family members who might be young and sometimes foolish, but who loved you enough to give everything we had without being asked. That is what we needed. Not recognition of our service, but recognition of our hearts." The chamber remained silent, stood before her, his ancient face reflecting emotions that his species had not experienced in. Shame, certainly, but also something else, something that might have been hope. "Ambassador," he said finally, "I cannot undo 60 years of blindness and neglect. I cannot bring back those who sacrificed themselves for a council that never acknowledged their names. I cannot erase the pain we have caused." He straightened, addressing not just Laura but the entire assembly. "But I can promise that things will change. Not because we need you, though we do. Not because we fear your absence, though we should. But because you have shown us something we had forgotten. You have reminded us that greatness is not measured in power or longevity, but in how we treat those who serve us with love." He turned back to Laura. "If you are willing to return, humanity will no longer sit at the back of this chamber. You will stand beside us as equals. Your votes will carry the same weight as any other species. Your voices will be heard in every decision." He paused. "But more than that, we will learn from you. We will learn how to serve without expecting reward. We will learn how to see the worth in every voice, regardless of age or power. We will learn to be the family you tried to show us we could be." Laura was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had worn in months. "We will return," she said, "not all at once but gradually. There is much work to be done, and we have never been able to resist work that needs doing." She extended her hand, too, in the human gesture of agreement. "But understand this, High Counselor. We do not return because you have offered us power or position. We return because we believe you are worth saving. We return because that is who we are. That is who humans have always been." Took her hand, his silver fingers closing around her smaller ones. "Then teach us," he said. "Teach us to be worthy of your faith." The council voted that day to restructure itself completely. Humanity was granted equal standing, but more significantly, every species committed to a new principle. Contribution would be recognized regardless of its source. Sacrifice would be honored regardless of who made it. No voice would be dismissed simply because it was young or different. As the session ended and representatives began to disperse, Commander approached Laura in the corridor outside the chamber. "I must ask you something," she said. "After everything the council did, after all the years of being ignored and dismissed, why did you come back? You could have let us collapse. You could have demanded anything you wanted, and we would have had no choice but to agree." Laura looked at the commander with that same patient expression she had worn throughout her years of diplomatic service. "Because that is not who we are," she said simply. "We do not help because we expect something in return. We help because helping is who we are. We left to teach you a lesson, but we came back because you are worth saving." She smiled. "Everyone is worth saving, Commander, even those who have not yet learned to see the value in others. That is the human way. It always has been." Watched as Laura walked away, heading toward the human section of the diplomatic quarter where much work awaited. Around her, the council was beginning its long process of healing and transformation. There would be difficult days ahead, old habits to break, new understandings to build. But for the first time in a very long while, there was hope. And in the great chamber where 400 species gathered to shape the future of the galaxy, the seats in the human section no longer sat at the back. They had been moved to the center, not by human request, but by unanimous council vote. A small gesture, perhaps, but a meaningful one. It was a reminder that the youngest voice in the room might carry the greatest wisdom, that those who serve without complaint might teach the most important lessons, and that the true measure of a civilization was not its power or its age, but its capacity for love. The humans had shown them that truth through silence and absence. Now they would show them again through presence and partnership, and the galaxy would never be the same.